He asked Tamim to provide lamps for all the city streets in Medina. Upon the completion of this job, the Prophet said, "May Allah enlighten the heart of Tamim ad-Dari, for if I had a daughter, I would have asked her to marry him." From that point on, the city's name took an adjective to become Al-Madina al-Munawwara, or the Enlightened City. The spiritual, political, civic, and social developments of the city should help in understanding why Muslims do not separate religion and state. The question of separation between religion and state relevant to Islam is addressed by Karen Armstrong in her book, Muhammad, a Biography of the Prophet. She states, "In Europe, we have gradually evolved an ideal which separates church and state, and we usually blame Islam for confusing two areas that are essentially distinct. But the Christian experience should not prejudice us against other cultural and religious traditions, which have developed under different conditions." Muslims escaped Mecca before facing extinction, but they would continue to be in mortal danger for the next 5 years in Medina.
The Meccans were, in fact, persecuting the Muslims, not only when the Muslims were living in Mecca, but then they still were trying at the end of the day to enjoy their pride of place and to, in many ways, marginalize the Medinan community. Islam is a religion of peace, and Muhammad, the Prophet, he tolerated a lot of persecution, abuse, and suffering, suffered a lot at the hands of his enemies, and did not want to shed blood or go to war. And God had to tell him to fight those who persecute you.
The Prophet had to migrate, leave Mecca and come to Medina. They did not leave him alone there. They kept coming and attacking the city of Medina, one after another.
In Muhammad, a Biography of the Prophet, Karen Armstrong states, "It was essential that Muslims display an image of strength and decisiveness if they were to survive the lawless state of Arabia 7th century. In Medina, whenever the Prophet heard that one tribe, urged by Mecca propaganda, was preparing to invade Medinan territory, he would march aggressively to forestall the attack, and the opposition tended to melt away as soon as the Muslims arrived."
And so we see a series of battles. In the Battle of Badr, against overwhelming odds, the Muslims win. In the Battle of Uhud, the situation's reversed, and indeed the Prophet is injured.
The story of the Battle of the Pact began with the Meccan Quraysh leaders summoning all its confederates, 10,000 people, and marched towards Medina with the intention of finishing off the Muslims. This was a year after the Battle of Uhud. The battle ended peacefully without an actual fight because the Muslims dug a deep ditch between the flatland of Medina and the mountains outside the city. They strategically placed their soldiers on the mountainous side and along this ditch. The Meccans were taken by surprise when they were faced by the ditch and were unable to cross it or penetrate the Muslim defensive lines. After 40 days of siege and attempts to engage the Muslims in a battle, Quraysh soldiers gave up and returned home. Muslims believed their struggle, or jihad, paid off in preventing another bloodbath and a major loss of life.
War has to be avoided as much as possible. For this reason, Islam said that you should be strong. If you are strong, your enemies will not attack you. There will be no war.
Muhammad sent several expeditions to the rest of the tribal communities of Arabia, announcing their strong presence and making alliances with them before Quraysh did. Although these early battles made a significant psychological outcome, the resulting casualties were quite small. With all three battles combined, casualties from both sides were less than 200 people. While Islam's beginnings were full of troubling times, battles, and hardship, at no time did Muhammad seek to compel followers to the new religion. To Muslims, there is no compulsion in matters of faith.
Islam absolutely forbids compelling people, coercing people to accept Islam. La ikraha fid din. Very categorical statement. There is no compulsion allowed in matters of religion. In many other places, the Quran says you cannot compel people to accept the faith. So only convey. In the countries where Islam is spread, you still have Christian groups, Jewish groups, Zoroastrian groups, people of many other faiths.
Between the battles for self-preservation against the Quraysh tribes, the way Islam spread throughout history, or some of the more recent events in the world, the Quran is one of the most misinterpreted books of any religion.
To interpret the Quran, you need a number of things. First of all, you need a very thorough command of the Arabic language, that for Muslims the Quran is revealed in Arabic. And just linguistically understanding the language becomes so important. Then understanding the context. How did this verse, or how did that verse come to be revealed? What was the context in which these verses were revealed? How do these fit into Islamic history and interpretation? It's not that you can interpret the verses totally different from how other people have done that. You're free to interpret the verses, but you're bound by the fact that these really are God's words for all people in all times.
Because Quran is a universal document, it is for all time, for all places, for all people, but it certainly came at a particular time, to a particular person, in a particular language, in particular circumstances.
Each text that talks about fighting and violence has to be seen in terms of when was that revealed and what context did it appear. And therefore, for example, one may see a passage like slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Okay. But often, number one, that passage is quoted out of context, and often only the first part of the passage is quoted. In most of these passages, the verse then goes on to say, but should they stop fighting? When they stop fighting, then remember that God is compassionate. One has to stop fighting. And so many of these passages are dealing with instances in which the community is under siege and the community is being told to fight and to fight back, and that the community has the right and duty to do that. But the other thing that's interesting is that at times when it says slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, the unbelievers being referred to are the Meccans.
The word jihad denotes physical, moral, spiritual, and intellectual efforts exerted for a particular goal.
The very term jihad in Arabic means to strive, to struggle, to exert oneself in the path of God. Jihad fi sabil Allah, struggling in the path of God. Its primary meaning in the Quran means the struggle to realize God's will. A Muslim is one who submits, one who follows God's will. And so in many ways, it indicates what every believer has to do. Every believer, whether Muslim, Jew, Christian, etc., struggles in this world to be good, to be moral, to live up to one's faith. And that's the primary meaning of jihad.
The Quran teaches that war and bloodshed is always abominable. Diplomacy and reconciliation are divine mechanisms to restoring peace, security, and hope.
Violence is to be avoided as much as possible. It is something which is evil, which is bad.
When the Muslim state was strong enough to defend themselves and were no longer afraid for their lives, they pursued reconciliation with the Meccans. For example, during the 6th year from his migration to Medina, the Prophet, with 1,400 people, peacefully moved toward Mecca to conduct the ritual of the Lesser Pilgrimage. The Quraysh leaders, however, sent 50 horsemen to block the main route of the pilgrims and to attack the Muslims as they approached. Even though the Muslims were many folds greater in number and could have attained an easy victory, the Prophet took a different route through the narrow and rocky canyons that were extremely difficult to cross in order to reach Mecca. When the Muslims realized they would not be allowed to perform their ritual, they negotiated with Quraysh a resolution for peace known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The treaty, among other things, called for no war for the next 10 years, and meant the Meccans are to allow the Muslims to perform the Lesser Pilgrimage in the following season. Many of Muhammad's companions were dissatisfied and angry, and felt it was humiliating to sign such a treaty. Karen Armstrong, in her book, A Biography of the Prophet, stated, "Muhammad was a peacemaker who risked his life and nearly lost the loyalty of his closer companions because he was so determined to reconcile with Mecca. Instead of fighting an intransient war to the death, Muhammad was prepared to negotiate and to compromise. And this apparent humiliation proved, in the words of the Quran, to be a great victory."
The Prophet was in an area of Arabia in which you had tribal warfare. And Arabia was located between two massive empires, the Sassanid and the Eastern Byzantine Empire, who were themselves warring among themselves. The Prophet brought peace to Arabia. He brought Islam, and Islam, submission to the will of God, the religion of Islam was to transcend all tribal and ethnic affiliations. And so he brought peace to Arabia.
Islam absolutely forbids attacking people who are innocent. Islam says you should not initiate violence. The Quran says do not aggress against those who do not aggress against you. So even if there is difficulties and problems, try to see that the Quran says that when people do wrong to you, you should do good to them, so that this is the way you can bring friendship and good relations.
The Prophet's wisdom in making peace and uniting his people did not stop at only political treaties, but he used the social customs of Arabia to overcome factions and animosity in the land. Who he married is an example of this. The Prophet married Hubayba, the daughter of the Quraysh leader Abu Sufyan. Later he married a Jewish lady, Sufiya, the daughter of the chief of the Nudair tribe. The Prophet also married a Christian lady, Maria. Even though both these ladies accepted Islam, these marriages are symbols showing that Islam transcends barriers. It also shows that Islam seeks to build bridges and relationships with other communities and other religions.
The Prophet in his own personal life often sought to bring about that peace through diplomacy and indeed through a number of his marriages. So when we look at the marriages of the Prophet, they occur for a number of reasons. He married widows, but the Prophet also was involved in marriages, much as later on we see rulers involved in marriages that cement relationships with other tribes.
A chronological timeline of the marriages of the Prophet reveals the role of these marriages to bring about peace. The Prophet married his first wife, Khadijah, at age 25. She was a widow of age 40. They stayed married until she died. He was then 50 years old. He stayed single for the next 3 years until the age of 53, when in Medina the Prophet married his second wife, Aisha. In the next several years, during the reconciliation with Quraysh and the tribes surrounding Medina, he made the rest of his other marriages. These marriages were instrumental in ending the violence and securing lasting peace. The Prophet used other social customs to create peace and friendship.
When the Prophet was in Medina, he noticed Jews fasting on a particular day, and he asked them, why do you fast on this day? And they explained to him that this was the day in which God had saved Moses. And so for the Prophet Muhammad, the idea was that this was just as important a day for Muslims as it was for Jews. And so the Prophet Muhammad fasted on that day too. In the Islamic calendar, it's the 10th day of the month of Muharram, the day of Ashura. And so Muslims still fast on that day, similar to the Jewish understanding of fasting.
Muhammad encouraged Muslims to create social bonds through their work within their communities. In his young age, before he received the message of Islam, Prophet Muhammad, along with his uncles, attended a meeting of a social organization called the Alliance of Virtue. This organization was established to help the oppressed and to foster justice in and around Mecca. After receiving the revelation, the Prophet showed his esteem with such organizations and said, I had witnessed, along with my uncles, a meeting of the Alliance of Virtue in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan, whom I loved more than the most precious thing, and if I were to be called to join it in Islam, I would. Muslims believe in fostering good traits and condemn evil acts. In fact, one of the lesser pillars of a Muslim is fostering good and forbidding bad. This is known as Al-Amir bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi an al-Munkar, meaning commanding the doing of what is right and forbidding what is wrong. This philosophy allows the Muslim to practice what is known by all people to be good, such as obeying traffic laws, penalizing the criminal, stating the truth, etc., and also rejects what is known as bad or